Day 1280 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 1,078,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 920 in the past day. Then as for hardware, 1 tank, no APVs, 45 artillery, 1 air defense system, and 118 soft target vehicles. But as for those minuscule, heavier vehicle losses, either Ukraine's getting really bad at zeroing in on that kind of Russian armor, or this fresh footage of the Russian army's continued reliance on donkey supply chains could arguably suggest there's not a great deal of heavy armor to destroy. Now to the map, with more reports overnight of drone sorties traversing Russian airspace. And firstly, just hours ago, a major oil pipeline in Russia, the Ryazan-Moscow line, has exploded, with sources at the scene reporting the event sparked a large fire, and in doing so, cutting off one of the capital's most important supply routes. Now, the backstory here is that the pipeline, operational since 2018, was designed to cover Moscow's urban and regional demand, but now also serves the critical secondary function of supplying Russian forces to the south. And though it's referred to as an oil pipeline, it's actually a refined fuels pipeline, especially diesel. Certainly an important petroleum product for any army, with the fuel from Ryazan that feeds into trains, storage hubs, and onward delivery systems designated to sustain frontline units. For Moscow, it's another energy disruption with higher prices at the pump or not for sale at all. And for the army, it's a supply chain choke point that adds to the already existing risks in slowing operations dependent on steady automotive fuel flows. Now to Rostov, where a series of explosions jolted the region's capital overnight, leaving smoke hanging above the city, and where the blasts followed a region-wide drone alert. But one of the heaviest hits was reported to land at the Taganrog air base, to the east of the Rostov-on-Don city itself. Unfortunately, it's one of the more rare incidents where we don't actually have the footage on the Taganrog subject matter. Next up, and to the nearby Novoshitinsk refinery, with the flames subsiding, coming to a close after day 6 of firefighting. Most of the crude storage tanks were destroyed, each with a capacity of 80,000 cubic meters, which is equal to 32 Olympic-size swimming pools. And where this earlier attack had led to tearing through the pipeline overpass. Now, overall, for these types of incidents, this has become quite problematic for Russia, especially with most Russian motherland oil refineries are now within Ukrainian long-range drone distance. The exception being Omsk at 2,800 kilometers away from Ukraine, and where it also happens to be Russia's largest oil refinery, but wouldn't you know it, likely no longer out of range due to the most recent introduction of the new Ukrainian Flamingo drone. I'd say the target is set on this one. Now to follow up with a related update, and in a rare moment of candor from the well-known Russian blogger Golikov, who came to an admission that cuts close to the bone, as he acknowledged that Ukrainian analyst Konstantin Mashevets had it right. The relentless campaign against Russia's fuel depot and rail arteries is crippling their army's ability to maneuver. Golikov admitted that Ukraine's strikes on refineries, fuel trains, and rail hubs are a deliberate effort to choke mobility at its source. Of course, we know this, with fuel stocks destroyed and transport links severed, redeployments stalled, equipment sits idle, and units are forced into piecemeal action. But what stings more, he added, is that Moscow still has no systemic answer to protect these fragile lifelines, with most of them being stationary sites that are just dangerously far too close to aerial threats coming from Ukraine. Now to the main map, with visually the most concerning backdrop for the AFU, due to Russian forces advancing recently into or on the the outskirts of Sobolivka, west of Kupiansk, making a tactical shift on the city's perimeter. Ukrainian defenses remain active. However, Russian elements are now operating closer to the city center. On the logistics side, the main supply corridor via Blahodativka is under pressure for defending forces, though they are no stranger to taking secondary routes, in this case through Ozinova, along the railway line which continues to function despite vulnerability to drone strikes from the enemy. Ukrainian units are still holding ground within the city and appear focused on maintaining freedom of movement along this axis, even under the intensified pressure we now see. But it's really on Russia to maintain this momentum right now, because as it stands, they're operating in an environment with defending Ukrainian forces which are positioned on opposing sides of them. It almost feels strange to note that the Russians have crossed the Oskol River to the west, whereas Ukrainian forces hold positions on the eastern side, after the very same river. Oh, then also, just hours ago, somewhere among the action in Kupiansk, the forces of the AFU's 10th Arms Army Corps destroyed the enemy's ammunition field depot, said to be directly in the Kupiansk region, and likely somewhere around the choke point where they push ammunition into the fight. Then to head down the map and in among the Donetsk direction, the AFU continues to destroy the enemy, taking out 6 heavy guns and a dozen smaller vehicles, plus 1 tank. But there's also a lot of activity right now with the Russian forces in the Katarinivka direction, with reports pointing to their presence in or around the village. And overall for this region, if you switch to the satellite view, it's a location that you realize just how close this front is to the town of Konstantinivka, and has been for well over 12 months now, with the town being not even 10 kilometers away from the most forward Russian positions, leading the AFU tirelessly exerting pressure to hold the invader back. Then to move more central on the Donetsk map, firstly with Ukrainian forces that struck a Russian military facility in the city of Makivka, again, which is northeast of Donetsk, striking with kamikaze drones overnight. And secondly for this region, at the front contact point at Pokrovsk, keeping busy, as Ukrainian armor is brought directly into the fight, with footage of a Leopard 2A4 main battle tank maneuvering into urban streets, firing its 120mm gun at near point-blank range into a building where a Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group had entrenched themselves. The 155th Brigade later confirmed the action, noting that the tank's close-quarters firepower provides, or in this case proved, decisive in eliminating the Russian reconnaissance group, the DRG, or the Diversionary Reconnaissance Group. So it's a rare glimpse at heavy Western armor being employed in dense city combat, highlighting both the intensity of the battle for Pokrovsk and the risks Ukrainian crews are taking to keep pressure on Russian infiltrators operating on the edge of the urban zone. It's also a move based on confidence, given the threat of inbound enemy kamikaze drones, with a full catalogue of ERA or explosive reactive armor blocks splashed across the Leopard MBT. Then to head further south, reaching Zaporizhia, where Russian forces took a bite out of Olivska, zooming right in for that one square kilometer of land, and then at the same time, on the southern flank, 10 kilometers further south, Ukrainian forces have retaken part of Malinivka in the Heliopol direction, driving the enemy out of the central part of the town. But where you can really see it heating up on the map, with Ukrainian rocket artillery and kamikaze drones striking Russian military sites in the occupied territories of the south, with Kherson at the center of this latest campaign. Explosions ripped through the multiple positions of the occupied left bank, with footage filmed by Russian troops themselves that shows the aftermath of bomber drone strikes tearing into their encampments. In the videos, soldiers can be heard shouting in panic as fires spread across the strike zone. This mix of drones and precision rocket artillery points to an evolving doctrine of layered attacks, with Ukraine increasingly pairing systems to overwhelm enemy defenses and ensure repeatability with these types of high-impact strikes against entrenched Russian positions in the south. And speaking of Kherson and rocket artillery, minus another Russian grad in this southern front to be seen. Then to take a further look around the map, somewhere in the east, a base housing Russian occupiers was accurately rendered inaccessible and destroyed by AASM Hammer glide munition drops, as launched by a Ukrainian Air Force MiG-29 fighter jet. On this occasion, expected to be up to 20 Kremlin invader troops eliminated. Then also, somewhere in the east, the first sighted and damaged, or destroyed, 1955 D-74 towed artillery piece of the war. This one's a Russian loss, with Ukraine having phased them out decades ago. Russia, however, kept them in service until the late 1990s and early noughties, with several hundred pushed into storage just before this war. These howitzers, considered obsolete by today's standards, require a heavy truck to move them, which is where the charred skeletal remains can be seen in the background of this photo. The howitzer weighs in at just under 6 tons, which is these days considered far too heavy for a field gun, especially for this gun that operates on the smaller 122mm caliber artillery shells. More modernized variants at this size are somewhere between 2.5 to 3.5 tons. These old boy pieces also take about 3 to 5 minutes to set up, which is far too long in today's battlefield where counter-battery radars locate firing positions within seconds, making these post-World War II pieces not exactly something an army, a modern army, would deploy by choice. That is, if they had better alternatives available, from storage to scrap in one move. Now, headed to the news, and starting in the US, with President Donald Trump's latest remarks on Ukraine, coming in a dose of mixed offhand rhetoric followed by concrete policy, as during a televised cabinet meeting at the White House, he brushed off Russia's refusal to recognize President Zelensky's legitimacy when responding to a question, calling it bullshit, quote-unquote, and posturing from the Kremlin, but added that no side enters a war expecting to lose, a point he illustrated with Ukraine facing an enemy many times greater its size, suggesting Ukraine's role in starting the war, as opposed to him, well, not framing it as a defensive measure from Ukraine. But then in his contrasting and substantive messaging, Trump pledged to expand US arms sales to NATO allies aiding Kyiv, reinforcing Ukraine's support network and signaling Washington's intent to keep its partners supplied in the conflict. So it's just another not-so masterclass in diplomatic doublespeak, but ultimately, the net effect points towards continued backing for Ukraine through NATO. Meanwhile, and still in the US, Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, during an interview has been pushing his latest fast-track narrative on ending the war in Ukraine. He meets with Ukraine's top officials Yermak and Umarov in New York this week, and also stated that he speaks daily with Russian officials and insists Putin definitely wants peace, with a, as he put it, proposal on the table focused on the Donbass. And according to Witkoff, there has never been such progress before. He says lines like this quite a bit now. Witkoff claimed that Trump should be at the negotiating table to finalize the deal, crediting his influence for recent progress, and acting like a peace deal is almost settled, all but settled, but then asked if Ukraine might have to cede land not yet occupied. He said only Zelensky can decide, stressing Kyiv's own need for security guarantees, and with voicing hope that a framework could emerge by year's end or sooner. Now, Ukraine has repeatedly said it will not give up territory it controls, for example, areas inside the Donetsk region. So against that backdrop, with Witkoff's talks of a proposal on the table centered on the Donbass, and the way that he describes these issues constantly has me thinking that it seems as though he is operating in an entirely different reality. But you let me know on this one. Personally, I find his actions are ones that are in alignment with Kremlin's stalling tactics. That's just how it always matches up in my mind. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!